and welcome to Josef's Model Railway and Toy Room. Thank you as always for joining me. Just a little bit of housekeeping. You don't need to do any of this liking and following and subscribing and all of this howdy-doody. I just put the videos out there where I can, and I have the holly jolly greatest time doing so. Now, today, ballasting. There are a million videos on YouTube covering this at the moment, so why on earth do I need to do it? Well, I don't really think I do. But speaking to a few people, they thought maybe I should add my little touch to it. Really, I'm not going to cover anything that hasn't been discussed before in other videos, and a lot of those other videos are fantastic. Just go and watch them. I just wanted to share with you my exposure on what I did to get to where I am at the moment. The ballasting that you can see in front of you at the moment was done using our traditional ballasting tool, a speed ballaster, whatever you like. The whole idea is you sit it on the rails, there are some openings in the bottom, you deposit the ballast into the hopper at the top, you run it along the track, and it deposits it. But I had some pretty howdy-doody results. We're going to actually see that in a demonstration. I'm going to show you method using this and what I've done since then, because I wasn't really happy with a lot of the results that I was getting from this. What's done is done, that's fine, but you're going to have a look at why I'm doing it another way. I did cover this when I was doing the disused section, which is the bit you just can't see underneath where the camera is at the moment. But if you check out the disused line that I featured some time back, you'll see I went into a bit of explicit detail. So I'm just going to show you the process I'm doing because, well, this section's been done, the other section hasn't been done. So join me today in a little bit of a ballast marathon. I apologize, there is quite a bit. I was going to break this up into two pieces, and I still in the back of my head think that was definitely the way to go. But I've decided to keep it as one juicy, chunky video. But don't despair. For those of you that want to skip ahead, just look for something in this direction. It'll tell you where the more practical demonstration is. The first bit, we're going to talk about the tools that are used, practical demonstration, and I'll carry on in a bit of time lapse to finish up what we need to do at the other end. So just fast forward to your heart's content. I always recommend you to just do what you need to do, and we just have a whole bunch of fun doing so. Let's get into it, shall we? Ta-da! Some people use some rather clever gadgets. When it comes to doing the ballasting, I have essentially two tools, but we'll call it three. First of all, we're going to need some sort of ballast. And voila, here is some ballast. Now, a couple of really quick things. Obviously, it comes in different grades and colors and shades like that. First of all, I just want to point out that most of the time when you're doing a HO or double O layout, obviously the medium ballast, and this is from Woodland Scenics, and this is a grey blend, is probably one of the most popular ones. But as you've probably discovered if you've gone a little bit closer, while it's a fantastic one and does give a beautiful appearance, by the time we put a scale model next to it with their foot, the stonework isn't quite right. That's why going for, again, grey blend, but this is in the fine ballast, actually will suit your scenery just a little bit better. Look, it depends on what you're doing, how you want it to look, but I really think it is good. And as we're going to see in the application, there's some key advantages to why I think the fine one is good. That's not to say we're still not going to be seeing some of the medium in other areas, but for the most part, what you're seeing in front of your eyes right here that still hasn't been glued down, because we're going to go through that shortly because we've still got to fill in the middle of the tracks, is we are just using the fine ballast, and here it is. Okay, let's pop that to the side. So we've got ballast. That's one tool off the list. The second tool, it's not a bad idea to have a brush if needed, just so you can come in and tidy it up to water. I'm usually not too worried about it. A few bits of ballast here and there, it's not the end of the world, but sometimes it's not a bad idea because the process of me putting our Scenic cement or our diluted PVA glue down means if it does start to run and you've got some in the wrong spot, it can be a bit messy. So a little brush just to keep things tidy, so be it. And or if you'd like to use your different type of painter's tape to seal sections up, that's not a bad idea, although I do recommend making sure you pull the tape up while it's all still wet. Otherwise it can get a bit problematic. My most important tool in this is a teaspoon. Any teaspoon will do. And what I tend to do, as you're going to see, I'm going to use a teaspoon to decant it out. The final thing is a reasonably stiff but fine brush, which I can get in between each sleeper and comfortably get the ballast off the ties, so to speak, and or I can make sure it's seated in between each sleeper. That's probably the most important one. Now, it doesn't mean I end up spending a lot of time in between areas, but to get the result I'm looking for, fantastic. And of course, the number one tool that we all must have, fingers. Because when it comes time to clearing lines down, using your fingers, nothing's going to beat using these beauties. But again, the brush is handy, especially when you're coming around point work, to make sure everything's moving the way it should. Now, a common product that many people will use and swear by, and I'm not saying it's not a bad thing, for those of you this may just be the ticket you need, I've got to talk about these ballast dispensers or hoppers. There's all different ones, some pretty snazzy ones out there with the little handles, and away you go. These are really good. You can sit them on the track, load it up, run it along, and it's going to spread it out. This is a very cheap one. It's just a cheap 3D printed one. It's been useful as we've got going, but as you can notice, I've put tape across the middle because it was just throwing way too much ballast down the middle, and it turned out to be a bit of a waste. And you can't, once it's sort of in there, yes, you can suck it up, but it's hard to work it out where it needs to be. So I found cutting the middle off and doing the edges to not be too bad. But the downside is, what it meant is across the shoulders, it was starting to build up. So even when I took my fingers and worked it out, and then took a brush to try and do it, you end up with these little divots around the sleepers, and it just doesn't look natural. Here's a couple of shots of some earlier work that I did back on the first loop, and you can see that it's really not too good. The other thing is the sleepers really start to look really buried down into the ballast, where in real life, if we have a look at a quick picture here, you'll see generally the tracks are sitting on top. So it's just something to consider. So one of the number one tips I'm going to kick this video off with right now, and I'm not going to lie, I don't want to say it's a regret on building this layout, but if I was to ever do another layout, I would, as you'd be aware, I went along on different sections and I started painting either a brown or I've been using a grey just on the under thing of where we're doing our landscaping and that. But I really do wish I would have painted our cork underlay with some sort of a color. It's not the end of the world, and the cork, you know, is a pretty neutral type of color. So by the time the ballast is there, it's not the end of the world, but I think it means that I could probably be a little more sparing with the ballast as it was dispensed, and overall it gives a very, very nice effect. However, it is what it is. Well, don't chuck in the bucket just yet. There's a couple of things we need to talk about when it comes to securing our scenery and or our ballast down. The first thing is, before we come along with the glue, is we need to wet it. That way the glue isn't going to bead and cause problems, and everything's going to just flow nicely. Now, for those of you with the deeper pockets and you're using your isopropyl alcohol, that's a fantastic thing to do. However, it can get expensive. The results are quite good, but this is the approach I'm using. We put this one to the side. You need some wet water. What do I mean by that? You could just use water, fine. But if you just add a bit of dishwashing liquid to your water and then spray it on, you're going to find it's going to not be as hard, and the surface tension is going to break out nicely. To all those wonderful people living in Parachilna in South Australia, you all know what I mean with that hard water. We can come and decant our water with our traditional type of spray bottle. And okay, that can work, but it doesn't work for me very well. And again, for a long time, you've probably seen in the videos, here's one here, and it does quite well. However, it's not a very controlled spray, and sometimes when you blast it along, it can actually blow some of the scenery out of way with the big drops of water. So what we really need is a fine mist type of one. Now, there are several out here. I can't find some of my more important ones, but this is one of the ones I use for my wet water. So in here, we just have water with probably about 5 to 10 drops of dishwashing liquid, and here we go. What's so important about this? A nice even coating that we will have to go back a few times, but nothing's going to move as you spray it along. It's nice and even. That's hence why I've got this bucket here for a bit of a demonstration, and who knows how this is going to turn up in the video. But the point is, our traditional one, as we come along, you can see I sort of get these droplets sort of forming and falling, and the spray is all right, but as I sort of let go, you can see them just falling in front of me here. So it's not a bad way to go, but it's not ideal. These, which to be fair, as I understand, just talk to any of your barbers or hairdressers or any of these types of people, they'll know what this is all about, and you can pick them up for a few dollars anyway, no different than any of the others. But the whole idea is you can see it's pressurized. So as I do it, it's still going. But look at how fine it is. There's no unusual sort of bits coming out of it as it finishes. There's no big droplets. It's absolutely smooth and fine. So absolutely, one of these is invaluable. Look, it's great with the Scenic cement as well, although please make sure that you clean it out after each time, because that glue's gonna jam things up and get horrible. But for the wet water, which is what I really use this for, brilliant stuff. So definitely make the wise investment. Get one of these pressurized misting fine sprayers. You're going to love every minute of it. So once we've given it a few sprays and everything's nice and wet and in place, and remember, it is just water, it's going to dry up, so don't panic too much. Don't worry that it's hitting the top of the tracks. It's all going to dry up. We can come along and clean it accordingly. Now we come down to securing it all. We've got it nice and wet. We're going to need to hold it down with our Scenic cement or what have you. Now, my traditional mix is mixed up into once one of these bottles is empty, I mix it up, and then we just pour in and go. I will just say that in the finer work, I do like to use an eyedropper just so I can drop and decant accordingly, especially when I'm working around that intricate point work. I don't want to cause any problems there, and it can be a good way to go. Otherwise, off comes the lid and I will just gently pour it. Nothing's going to move. It's all nice and wet and it's going to flow freely. But our particular Scenic cement, this comprises not of the actual PVA glue in this one. You'll actually find what we have is 1 part matte Mod Podge to 2 parts water to 3 drops of dishwashing liquid, and that's going to go a long way. The PVA and water combination works just as well. It's just that the matte Mod Podge does give a slightly better finish and really doesn't affect the colors as much as the glossiness that you can end up with just using a PVA glue.
Well, I wasn't going to do a demonstration, but here we are. Okay, so before we can get started with ballasting, I just need to lay a little bit of track down. So that's what we're going to do really quickly. I've talked before about this Copydex thing, and some people glue it down with PVA, some people nail it, some people screw it. We'll probably cover a more in-depth video. I have not had a lot of great success with the whole screwing it down. The Copydex thing, I think we can bust the myth that acoustically there isn't a benefit, and we'll talk more about that when we get to the fiddle yard. To the demonstration, 100% PVA, 50 Scenic cement that we've knocked up, and a couple of weights we need to weight this down with. The same thing, but we just have it here. We also have a little bit of wet water, and we'll come in with our ballasting materials in just a minute. But let's just quickly get a little sample set up here. Before we get started, my number one tool of choice has always got to be our baking paper. Now, this is the extra long variety. I probably don't need it. We're just going to lay this down. Let's just grab that timber and pop it into place now. And we're going to do 1 and 2 with my version, and if you don't want to follow my steps to see what we end up with. You don't need to do the cork underlay. I'd actually do an extra layer and build it up. But the reason we do it is it does give that nice sort of slope down on an embankment where train lines are usually raised up just to cope with weather and things like that. So that's why we generally do it, and that's why the method I'm talking about here becomes important as we'll come in closer shortly. Now we'll also just need some lengths of track. And again, during my process of the track cutting, I did prefer to use the Dremel tool. So we'll just quickly lock this into place. Now generally at this point I'd usually weight this down and leave it overnight before we proceed, but there's no harm in basically what we're doing at the moment. So we're just going to just quickly whip a little bit down here. This is reasonably quick drying, so we shouldn't have to wait too long. And then we'll get straight to the ballasting. So as you can see, that's pretty much the process we're going to do for this demonstration, is lay it down. And again, to weight things down, I just like to use soda cans. They fit nicely into their place. You can use multiple ones to bring it in, which works well when you're going around the curves. And in this case, we're just going to leave this for about 20 minutes and we'll come back and get started with the ballasting. Right, that's been 20 minutes. In fact, it's been 2 weeks. That's just sometimes how this thing goes. But here we are, 2 pieces of track that are nicely in place. So what we're going to do in one, we're going to use our ballast spreader and run it across. And the other version, we're going to just use our teaspoon. And let's just have a look at what we're up to. So we're going to use our ballast spreader. We're just going to use some grey fine ballast at the moment. And we're obviously, in both applications, of course, just using our diluted PVA glue. On the other side here is the way I have been doing it. So in which case we decant our ballast, once again, our fine grey, just using a teaspoon. We can clean it up using a small brush. We of course apply wet water, and in which case we are using this type of applicator, which gives a nice fine mist. Again, as always, it's just water with dishwashing liquid. We'll just cover the other section up at the moment just so we don't get any overspray. So we're going to take our ballast spreader. We'll apply a little bit of ballast in there. And of course the key is here, you just need to run it back. And as you can see, it seems quite simple. One key thing you'll see here is that we certainly did get a nice shoulder that's coming across the side. So I think that's quite a unified approach, and I'm quite happy with the way that happens. And as you've seen in some videos, I'll often take a little bit of tape it down, and then I can pull it off and get a nice edge as needed. If we come in now, you can certainly see that this really is prototypical in some applications, but for the most part, a little bit of definition would be good. So in which case, just your finger is usually a good indication of just brushing it away, and away you go. But also the edges of the sleepers here are good to take a finger, but if you're probably just noticing there, as I take a finger, I'm starting to create another little bit of a dip here, and that's not how it should look at all. It should be unified and falling down. You've seen me in videos before correct this generally by using a pop stick. I'll just use my finger here just to sort of shape it, taper it down. But then when you start looking very closely, you may notice using a finger, I'm creating some ripples, and that isn't really what I want to do. You've seen me in videos take a vacuum cleaner on an angle just to sort of suck up some loose stuff. Not a bad way to go, but in general, we're starting to have to do a lot of work for this. Just for the sake of the demonstration, I'm just going to run over with a brush. But there's a lot of excess that comes in. Now you can, like you've seen in the video before, I put tape over the middle of mine because really it is dispensing quite a lot through the middle. And I did get good results by taping it up, but as you can see, this just is going to need a lot of work for what's just happened. And we're not going to waste any more time on that, because this is just as a demonstration. Now we'll come over with the droplets of wet water. And you can see that's not too bad. I'm getting a reasonably good spray. Take our Scenics cement. I do often like to start around the edges and let it sort of breathe up around the sides if needed. And you can certainly see that capillary action as it starts drawing itself in and around where it needs to be. I just give it the initial one, and you can imagine in a big section, by the time I've literally gone along doing this, by the time I come back to the rest just to put a bit more down, we've filled in all the blanks. So we will let that one dry. So while that's drying, any excess PVA, I do usually like to just come around and mop up just with a bit of paper towel or what have you. Now, at this point, leaving it overnight is pretty much the general way I like to let this set, and the next day we are good to go. However, while that is drying, we are now going to move over to the other side. So the second one, as I've mentioned before, I would like to just lay some paint down if we can. And even at this point, if the track has gone down, I'll still just paint right up and around to the edge. But we're not going to worry too much about that. We're talking about putting our ballast, gravel and or stones if you like, here onto the track. Now we're going to do the teaspoon method. There's really no right or wrong, other than we've got a bit of control here. Now, you'll probably notice as I'm putting this down, you'll probably notice I'm not going right in against the sleeper. In fact, on the first initial one, what I'm just trying to create is probably a little bit of a foundation here. I do want to come close to the sleeper, but that little excess building up around it is so I can manipulate it in without having too much. I'll also come back around the edge, and depending on some situations like the disused track, you'll recall that I actually had 2 or 3 sheets of cork underneath. So what I'd basically do is lay up a foundation to give me my nice edge, let it dry, and then I'd come back and build it up again. Otherwise it can quickly wash out. And we're just wanting to work it into those sleepers. And you can probably see what's starting to form now is we are sort of creating these steps going down. I'm just tapping it down now. I don't want to pull it and draw it up. I want to leave the rail nicely exposed from underneath where we can. This side is easier for me to do with the finger because I can literally see it. But obviously with the camera and the light, there's only so much I can do at a time. Now, depending on it, this isn't a bad point to come along and put it on accordingly, let it glue and dry and carry on. Now we just want to build up that slope nicely now. So tap, tap, tap. You can see just with that teaspoon, you can sort of control what you need. And that edge I talked about on the other one really isn't too bad. Even though this is freehand, we're still getting a nice little line going on here. And again, a little bit of variation and detail, I don't think are ever too bad at all. Now again, the middle, less is always more, I find. Again, take your finger at this point and just work it down into there. Now at this point, that looks a bit ordinary. Of course, if it was painted, not so bad. The good news is you can just come back and give it another little tap for what you need. Now at this point, it may look a little bit drastic since you can clearly see there are sections that aren't there. But once again, this is where we just want to take some sort of a brush and just gently spread it out, thinning it out nicely. Now don't worry too much about the bits that are going to start flicking up. Just make sure you've got them all in where they need to be. Somehow this is therapeutic. That's what they tell me. I don't believe it. So really, apart from actually just smoothing it out, you're also taking away the mound from where you've sort of deposited it, so it's got a more even sort of look to it. Now at this point, the finger, always those fingers, the greatest tool you can have. You'll get most of it done just using your fingers, but if there's a few little strays here and there, that's what your brush is all about. Now this looks absolutely fantastic to me. However, I will just point out, especially as we see a picture here, we will often see some of the ballast collected up and over and onto the sleepers. So having this most pristine look is just wonderful, but at the same time, I will certainly come along and I don't mind just bumping a few little stones over here and there, bumping a few stones here and there, just to give it a little bit of character on the line, which is usually quite common. Now the next part, we're just going to disconnect the camera so I can show you what's going on, particularly since we still have this one drying and we're about to do this one. But I want to bring you in at this point to have a look at why this extra bit makes a difference, I think. Now, here is the one we have done with our ballast spreader. Look, it's really not too bad, and on my first attempt, on my first layout, I would have just said looks pretty good. As long as we've gone through, maybe with a fingernail is the best. Just make sure it's nice and clear. Sometimes we use an old piece of rolling stock just to make sure it's nice and clear for the wheel to pass. Not too bad. If we just come in a little bit lower now, it's not really quite right, I don't think. You know, we've really got a lot of the track starting to be buried, and that realism just doesn't feel like it could be there. Let's move over to the other one, which we're just about to come down with the Scenic cement, and I think you can kind of see what I'm getting at here. We've got the detail with the actual sleepers where the seats are locking onto the rail. You can see it, and again, if you're weathering your track and painting it, which most people do with the rail, giving a lick with the airbrush and that, I think it's fantastic stuff. I haven't quite got around to that yet, but I think as you can see, and most importantly, if I do get the camera down, you can see we do have this definition on the steel rail underneath, and I really think that's what's going to elevate that image. And I think that's what's well worth doing in this situation. Okay, let's get this one glued in now. And so just one last thing is obviously I have the same combination mixed up here in this container where we've got some wet water and we've also got our Scenic cement. And of course, just using any eyedropper that you prefer. You can pick these up from any chemist or pharmacist or drugstore as they call it in the USA. You can suck some up and just come down bit for bit. And you can imagine you're in a bit more control as you can sort of just control drop by drop. So when you're working on points or intricate areas, it really is a good way to go. Give a good saturation. You can see everything's now turning white, so we don't have to worry too much about that. Now there's just one more step that I do like to do just before I walk away. Of course, just check, again, using the finger, and particularly if you've got your fingernails, I've just cut them the other day, but if you got them, to just grind in and run along the inner side of the track there, feeling in case there's any ballast that might just be in the way, which you'll pick out later with a toothpick anyway. But the last thing is, I usually like to come in pushing using my fingernails and pushing in the same direction, is just to come in grinding away on the top of that track work, both to sort of scrape anything off, but on the flip side, letting the rest of my skin wrap around it just to sort of clean the top of the track off, so we're getting rid of any excess Scenic cement that may have accumulated there. Again, if you have any particularly concerning sections, or particularly if you are working on points, you may need to just literally come in with some paper towel or something to just come in and give them a really nice clean if necessary, or rub out pieces where there needs to be contact or something. And I do make reference to just the typical type of paper towel, not tissues, particularly since a lot of tissues seem to feature things like eucalyptus oil and aloe vera, which is great on a bit of a runny nose, but it is coated in oil, and I'm trying to minimize any unnecessary oil or material on the track. Any little bits at this point while the Scenic cement there isn't a bad idea, just to literally grab a pinch of your ballast and just sprinkle it if you did notice some. Don't worry, at this point smoothing it down isn't that essential, since anything that didn't come through and dry off will suck up easily with your vacuum cleaner. But you are really just looking for obvious big gouges in where it may have slightly have shifted, or just somewhere where you may have honestly have missed. So we'll just let these ones dry now. Well, that's now been 24 hours and everything is nicely dried. In fact, if we just come in a little closer, you can see it's looking pretty good. So, well, now let's just shake off any excess for the sake of the demonstration. So you can see the result of what I'm talking about here. This really isn't a bad way to go, but if we just come to the other one, it looks like we've got a better foundation to start doing a bit more with, as opposed to this where it just sort of seems
somewhat finished, so to speak. One thing I forgot to mention is if you've got some cinders or bits of coal and stuff like that, just before you do lay your glue down, I'll often sprinkle some, depending on the line or where I am, just some across the track, particularly if obviously you're running a bit of a heritage type of line or something like that. I never think it's a bad thing in case there might be a steam train that comes out every now and then. So you would obviously just lay some on top, glue it down and do what we need to do. But we're not going to do that in this one today. A few extra points of which we have discussed in earlier videos. First of all, you may like to take, if you're not good with the airbrush or what have you and want to add some more detail, you can take these pens from Woodland Scenics. Rusty rail, the weathered tie, and obviously the bit for the steel rail. It's your typical type of shake them up, push down, and it'll start decanting out. And there's some pros and cons about using them, and they can be a wonderful addition. I'd leave that toward the end if you need them. Remember, the tracks will generally naturally tarnish, and that's basically what I'm going with for the moment. However, if you'd like to do something different, so be it. The other thing you hear me banging on about all the time is making good use of another thing you'll constantly see me banging on about is the use of these pastels, which you can pick up at any cheap shop or arts and crafts place in different colors, and they can be a wonderful way to brush on key detail where you may need them. The other alternative is operations like DCC Concepts offer their own weathering powder, and some bits of these can be useful, once again, depending on what you're doing. The pastels I usually use to integrate and interconnect the actual landscape around it to give a more seamless type of finish. You can see in this instance here where we've just ground a little bit of the brown down. If I was just to sprinkle a little bit of that on at the moment and take a brush and brush it in, you can see where it's sort of starting to meet. The stones are bringing up onto where the dirt could be down here, and the rain sort of splashed that sort of up. So that's the whole idea about that. However, that is a story for another day. I do want to just talk to you about this wonderful product here, which is the Peco brake dust. Now, they do make some other products as well, but what's really good, if this is a section of line, maybe there's a signal located down here where trains are naturally maybe slowing down and that, taking a little bit of this Peco brake dust, I always think is never a bad idea. And this is the kind of product you can usually be a little bit generous with. I'm just going to brush it, just working on here, and a little bit on the outside as well. Once you've got it on, let's just give it a quick dust over. We're not really taking anything away from it, but I think you can clearly see what we can achieve by doing this, just to give it that little bit more detail around the track work. Now, the other thing I do like to do as well, again, we could do it on the other section of track too, which for the most part, I'm just abandoning and showing you why I'm not really a big fan of using those ballast spreaders. However, on big applications, I get the logic of why you should be using it. Anyway, you get the idea of what we're doing here. Now, the final touch is, while this really does add a nice little effect here, the other top tip in this application is taking some sort of an engine oil. In this case, this is the MIG 1408 Fresh Engine Oil. Yes, it's the one that's featured in a previous video to which the lid was not on correctly and we ended up with quite the disaster. This product really does go a long way, and it is an oil. It's going to have the pong of an oil and everything else that goes with it. And generally with a more fine tip brush, not necessarily this one, but it'll do for the demonstration. And more so in more built up areas, it's a wonderful thing just to add the little stripe of oil that can be coming from the underside of some of the locomotives and even rolling stock if they have various air conditioning and other mechanical apparatus. Particularly in a bit where there's a siding, obviously you'd want to just let a bit more of this bleed down onto that ballast to soak in a bit more from a locomotive that may be sitting there for an extended period of time. Should you so choose to go around and possibly just dot a few other areas of interest if needed, so be it. The product does go a long way, and in this application, less is definitely more. Just start up building your layer up accordingly. And that's the process. So as you can see, it's a quick way to get some great results achieved. But I think we can see with the before and after, as you can see, perhaps you are doing a section that's going to be more buried down with dirt and some more overgrown things on it. And that's great. But in general, I guess you can see how just the overall build-up of too much in here becomes a problem. Of course, as I said, if you take the vacuum cleaner, you'll see other people, they'll put it on an angle and it will take up a lot of the loose stuff. But sometimes you need to go back and fill it back in. So just going slow and steady, I think, yields a much, much better result. You can control it. You can see, for me, I can see some of these bits where I need to come back in and over. Again, on your layouts, you know what you need to do. And for some of us, it might be, actually, there's going to be a signal going here or something else. So, but it's just those key bits that you'll notice. And by the time you start weathering this down, that brown of that Peco brake dust is starting to blend in with what would basically be, as you can see here, where the cork is starting to come through. So all in all, over time, that's really not a bad way, I think, to go. The other key thing is, as you can see, if we come in nice and close now, that little detail does go a long way. Most importantly, as we sort of come down on that profiled style of an angle there, you can see you've got the steel sort of rising up. It's got a nice interest point when you drop your head down and look toward the rail. Particularly if we come to the other one we shot and we look down, it just sort of seems like everything is completely buried away. And that's why at Knoodle Knocker Junction I did use some of this going around, and some regrets, but I've worked around it. As we look at our two here, for me the clear winner has got to be in this, and not just because I spent that little extra bit of time on it, but this looks like a railway track. This really just looks like two rails that have sort of turned into a bit of a mess. Well, here we are once again at the end of another epic video. Well, here we are at Knoodle Knocker Junction, and as we conclude, you can see that I'm not really 100% how this whole situation went down, and you can see how this would benefit if we were to go back to the original tactic. What you probably can't just see off the shot here is officially at this sleeper here on the track going down to where the fill yard will be, the grey ballast actually stops. And we're probably going to make it sort of semi-disappear, but I've left that for another day. But the techniques that we've seen will be more applied as we go on, so it's a little bit disappointing. The good news is though, you can certainly see here Peco brake dust from at the station halt where the train would be stopping, a bit of engine oil coming in and out and a little bit gathered around the junction itself. Just give that little bit more detail. I'm in a position here where it's all just sort of say, well, you know what, we may as well just put some lipstick on the pig because that's what we're dealing with at the moment. To rip all this up and start again is really not something I really want to do. It functions and operates well, the train goes around, and I think the scene is more important sometimes looking at other things than what's actually going on with the train on this particular section. But at least now you can understand why it's kind of important to watch all those ballast videos and get an idea for how to try and get it right. For me, what everyone else was talking about wasn't really working as well. My teaspoon and brush method and good old fingers seem to be the way to go. Just make sure you clean them after you've had some of that finger licking good chicken, because it can get a bit sticky otherwise. It's been a pretty comprehensive one. We may come back to another one in the future, just talking a bit more about that explicit detail, but I haven't even done that yet. And I'm talking more about around the station and the engine shed. So we're going to get to that in a slightly later video. So girls and boys, ladies and gentlemen, that's now going to do it for yet another video. As you can see, it was a bit of a time shift in that one to say, hang on, he's done so much work with the canal a few months earlier, and now we go back to there's nothing there because he starts the ballasting. That's just how some of these videos end up being, because I have the footage stored in at different stages. But here we are, we've come to the end. Thank you so much for joining me. I look forward to seeing you in the next one, and rest assured there's some quicker ones on the way and some amazing scenery that's going to be coming up very soon. Stay safe. Toodles.